This is a story about what happens when you push the wrong person too far. This is a story about family, about betrayal, about power, and about the kind of justice that doesn't just punish the guilty, but exposes every single lie they ever told. My name is Evelyn Vance, and this is how I destroyed the family that tried to destroy me. I want you to imagine sitting at a dinner table with people who want you gone. Not just dislike you, not just tolerate you with rolled eyes and passive-aggressive comments, but actively, methodically want you erased from their lives. That's where I was. That's where this story begins. But to understand how I got there, how I ended up in that chair with a glass of water in my hand and a target on my back, I need to take you back. I need to show you the architecture of betrayal, because nothing that happened that night was accidental. Every glance, every word, every carefully placed piece of silverware was part of a design. They had been building toward this moment for months. They just didn't know that I had been building too. My father's dining room was built for intimidation. That's not an exaggeration, that's design. General Marcus Vance had spent 35 years in the military learning that the fastest way to establish dominance wasn't through words, but through space. The table was mahogany, imported, hand-carved, long enough that the person sitting at the far end didn't look like family. They looked like a problem that needed to be managed. The ceiling rose 2 stories above us, supported by dark wooden beams that cast shadows in the evening light. The walls were covered in oil paintings of men in uniform, ancestors who had served, fought, and in some cases, died for causes that the current generation only pretended to understand. Everything in that room said power. The cold stone floors, the heavy drapes, the crystal glasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent, every detail was curated to remind you that you were small. That you were privileged to be there, that you owed something to the name Vance. But here's what I learned about power growing up in that house. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. Real power is quiet, confident, secure. The kind of power my father performed was something else entirely. It was theater. It was compensation. And once you saw the cracks in the performance, you couldn't unsee them. The paintings on the wall, for example, the men in those portraits weren't heroes. They were opportunists. Men who had married money, who had leveraged connections, who had built fortunes on the backs of others, and then commissioned artists to paint them as patriots. I used to sit in that room as a child and wonder if anyone else noticed the dead look in their eyes. The way their smiles never reached their cheeks. The way they seemed to be watching the room not with pride, but with judgment. As if they knew that their descendants were squandering everything they had stolen. My mother Lydia sat at my father's right hand, as always. She was cutting her sea bass into pieces so small it looked like surgery. That was her way. Controlled, precise, everything in its place. She had been trained since birth to be the perfect military wife, which meant she had also been trained to never, under any circumstances, make a scene. Her job was to smile, to pour tea, to arrange flowers, and to pretend that everything was fine even when everything was burning. I watched her knife work through the fish, and I thought about how many times I had seen that same controlled precision directed at me. The way she could cut a person down with a single sentence delivered in that soft, disappointed tone. The way she could make you feel like a failure without ever raising her voice. She had perfected the art of weaponized gentleness, a kind word that left a scar. Across from her sat my sister Caroline, and next to Caroline sat Julian Mercer, her fiancé. Caroline was smiling too much. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into the room. Not that she was happy to see me. We were far past the point where happiness entered our interactions, but that she was performing happiness. Her smile was too wide, too fixed, too carefully positioned at the corners of her mouth. It was the smile of someone who had rehearsed a scene and was determined to stick to the script. And Julian was doing something far more interesting. He had 2 phones. One sat on the table beside his wine glass, standard, expected, the kind of phone a successful defense contractor would have. But the other one, that one was hidden under the edge of the tablecloth near his thigh. A burner phone. Cheap case, no notifications visible, the screen dark. He would tilt it just enough to read incoming messages, then lock it fast. Subtle if you weren't paying attention. Obvious if you knew what to look for. I took a sip of water and let the ice touch my lip for a second. The cold grounded me. It reminded me that I was still here, still present, still in control even when everything around me was designed to make me feel otherwise. Julian caught me looking at him once. He smiled in that way men smile when they think money has replaced character. There was no warmth in it, no genuine connection, just a flash of white teeth and a tilt of the head that was meant to say, "I'm successful, I'm powerful, and you're sitting at the end of the table because you don't matter." He turned to me and said, "Everything okay, Evelyn?" His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had learned to say nothing while sounding like he was saying something. I looked at him for a beat longer than necessary. Then I said, "Perfect." I always enjoy family dinners that feel like depositions. My father didn't laugh. He never laughed when I was funny. Humor wasn't his language, control was. He set down his fork with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested he was resisting the urge to throw it. He leaned back in his chair, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. How do I manage this? How do I redirect? How do I maintain the appearance of normal family interaction while my daughter insists on being difficult? He said, "Can we get through one meal without that tone?" And I replied, "That depends. Can everyone else get through one meal without lying?" The word hung in the air between us. Lying. It was an accusation, but it was also a declaration. I was done pretending. I was done playing along with the fiction that we were a normal family having a normal dinner. Something was very wrong in this house, and I was the only one willing to name it. My mother closed her eyes for one tired second. That was her favorite move. The exhausted sigh, the subtle shake of the head, the unspoken message. "Look what I have to put up with. Look how difficult she makes everything." She liked to act exhausted instead of guilty. It tested better. It played into the narrative they had been building for months now, the narrative that I was the problem, that I was unstable, paranoid, obsessed with conspiracies that didn't exist. Caroline stepped in right on cue. She said, "She's been like this all week." And there it was, the opening salvo. She delivered the line gently with just the right amount of concern in her voice. A worried sister reaching out, trying to help. Wrong audience for me, excellent audience for them. Julian looked down at his plate, pretending to hate conflict. Caroline placed one hand over her chest like she was accepting a humanitarian award. She said, "I'm serious, Mom, tell him." She called me 3 times 2 nights ago, saying people were following her. I looked at her. I didn't feel angry anymore. Anger requires surprise, and nothing about this surprised me. I said, "No, I called you once. I asked why your fiancé's shell company was wired into a defense subcontractor in Virginia." My father's jaw tightened. I saw it happen, a small contraction of muscle, a brief flash of something that might have been fear before it was replaced by the more familiar anger. Julian reached for his wine and missed the stem the first time. His fingers fumbled, then found purchase, then lifted the glass too quickly. He took a drink that was more gulp than sip. Caroline gave me a sad little smile. She said, "This is exactly what I mean. The paranoia, the obsession. She twists normal things into these huge conspiracies." And I said, "Right, because men with burner phones and offshore transfers usually sell scented candles." My mother finally spoke. She said, "Evelyn, enough." Her voice had that polished donor luncheon tone. Soft, controlled, empty. The voice she used when she wanted to end a conversation without actually saying anything. My father folded his napkin with military precision. He placed it on the table beside his plate, and I could see his hands wanted to do something else. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life giving orders, having those orders followed, and now he was sitting at his own dinner table unable to control his own daughter. He was in the middle of a Senate campaign, and every meal lately felt like damage control. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a bad headline in human form. He said, "Julian is helping fund this family's future. You will treat him with respect." And I looked at Julian, really looked at him, took in the expensive suit, the perfect hair, the watch that cost more than most people's cars, and I said, "That depends on what country he's loyal to." Nobody moved. That part landed. Even Julian's careful composure cracked for just a moment. I had crossed a line, not just of family decorum, but of something deeper. I had questioned patriotism, loyalty, national security. In a room full of military history, with a father who had built his entire identity on service, I had suggested that the man sitting at his table might be a traitor. Caroline let out a breath like she'd been dreading this moment, which was impressive considering she'd spent the whole evening trying to create it. She said, "She did it again this morning. She told one of the staff not to leave their kids alone near me because I was managing optics. Do you hear how crazy that sounds? I said. It sounds accurate. Caroline turned to our parents instead of answering me. That was her thing. She never fought head-on if she could perform sideways. She said, I've tried to protect her. I really have. I almost smiled. That line was new. She'd practiced it. I could hear the rehearsal in the rhythm of the words, the careful pause after really, the slight crack in her voice on have. She was good. She could have taught master classes in manipulative grief. I set down my glass. The water inside it had gone still. I said, you should save some energy, Caroline. Fake concern burns calories. She blinked hard, then looked down. Perfect timing. A little wounded, a little noble. Julian cleared his throat. He said, maybe this isn't the night. But Caroline said softly, no, it is. Then she looked at me with wet eyes that had never once matched what she actually felt. She said, you scared me last week, Evelyn. I leaned back in my chair. I said, did I? Or did I get too close to something you wanted buried? My father's hand hit the table. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Silverware jumped. My mother flinched. One of the servants froze in the doorway and then disappeared. The room went still. My father pointed at me like I was a junior officer embarrassing him in front of command. He said, you have been unstable for months. Mood swings, accusations, aggression. You refuse help. You refuse reason. Every conversation turns into some fantasy about surveillance and corruption. I looked at him for a long second. Then I said, that's a strong speech for a man who never asks for proof unless it helps him lie. The doorbell rang. Nobody reacted with surprise except my mother, and even hers looked rehearsed. Late, performed. That told me what I needed to know. Julian sat up straighter. Caroline inhaled fast but hid it behind one trembling hand. My father didn't turn toward the foyer right away. He just stared at me with the cold patience of a man waiting for a problem to be removed by staff. A few seconds later, our house manager entered the dining room. He was pale, careful, walking like he was carrying something fragile. He said, sir, they're here. My mother looked down at her lap. Caroline whispered, thank God. Two large male paramedics walked in first. Clean uniforms, soft restraints in hand, calm faces. Behind them came a uniformed police officer with that neutral look cops use when they've already been told who the unstable one is. The officer addressed the room, not me. He said, we received a mental health welfare request. Of course he did. Caroline stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. Then she covered her mouth and started crying on command. I had to give her credit. It was a strong performance, not truthful, just well lit. She came toward me slowly. Tears on her cheeks, one hand stretched out like she was approaching a wounded animal. She said, Evelyn, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I have to do this to save you. You're not well, you're a danger to yourself. I looked past her at our parents. My father stood near the head of the table with both hands behind his back. He didn't defend me. He didn't question the timing. He didn't ask to speak privately. He didn't do anything a father would do if his daughter was being taken away against her will. My mother stayed seated and turned her face away like this was all too painful to witness, which was convenient since she had helped arrange it. That was the moment the room got honest. Not because anyone told the truth, but because nobody bothered hiding the lie anymore. The officer stepped closer to me. He said, Ma'am, we need you to come with us. Caroline started crying harder. She said, Please don't fight them, Evelyn. Please, we all love you. I let that hang there. Love, that word had done more criminal work in this family than money ever had. One of the paramedics moved carefully toward me. He said, We're going to make this easy, okay? I almost asked, easy for who? Instead, I pushed my chair back and stood on my own. That stopped everyone. No screaming, no panic, no overturned plates, no dramatic denial. If I'd wanted to act unstable, I had a full room of examples. I wasn't interested. I brushed a speck of dust off my shoulder, set my napkin on the table, and held out both wrists. The paramedic hesitated. I said, Go ahead. He wrapped the soft restraints around my wrists with professional caution. Not rough, not kind, just procedural. The officer watched me like I'd changed genres in the middle of a movie. Caroline's crying faded for half a second. There it was, confusion, small but real. She expected rage. She expected begging. She expected something she could point to later and call proof. What she got was compliance. Julian looked at me now, really looked at me, and I saw the first crack in him. Tiny, hairline, but there. I met Caroline's eyes. She still had that wet-faced, grieving sister act going, but underneath it, tucked deep in the corner of her mouth, was a smile. Small, mean, private. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd just removed the unstable younger sister who kept asking the wrong questions. She thought once the paperwork hit the system, nobody would listen to anything I said again. She thought a psych hold would bury my credibility, protect Julian's contracts, and keep our father's campaign clean. She thought she had planned the perfect trap. What Caroline didn't know was that being taken to a psychiatric facility was never her idea. It was mine. And the second those restraints clicked into place, she stopped being the architect of this evening. She became the bait. The ride to Oak Ridge Private Psychiatric Facility took 43 minutes. I counted. I counted because counting is what you do when you need to stay calm, when you need to keep your mind from spiraling into all the places it could go. I counted the traffic lights we passed. I counted the turns. I counted the breaths the paramedic next to me took. In, out, in, out. His breathing was steady, practiced, the breathing of someone who had done this dozens of times. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't suspicious. He was just doing his job. That's what made systems like this so effective. Most of the people working inside them weren't evil. They were just following procedures. They were just believing the paperwork. They were just trusting that someone else had done the due diligence, that someone else had verified the truth. They were cogs in a machine that had been designed to grind people down, but individually, each cog thought it was just turning normally. The restraints came off when we arrived. The door sealed behind me with a soft click that sounded a lot like a lock I had been waiting for. Oak Ridge Private Psychiatric Facility didn't look like a prison if you only glanced at the brochure version of it. Clean hallways, neutral colors, staff trained to speak in calm, measured tones. Everything designed to make control feel like care. But if you looked closer, if you paid attention to the details that the designers hoped you wouldn't notice, the truth revealed itself. The windows were reinforced. The doors had no handles on the inside. The cameras weren't just for safety, they were for observation. Every aspect of the environment had been engineered to remind you that you were not in control, that someone else was making decisions about your life, that your freedom was conditional on your compliance. The isolation room told the truth even more clearly. No sharp edges, foam-lined walls, a reinforced glass panel on the door. A camera fixed high in the corner. No personal items, no phone, no access to anything that could reach the outside world. They took my watch, they took my shoes, they checked my sleeves, my collar, my waistband. Standard intake. Thorough, but not thorough enough. The nurse assigned to me spoke like she was reading from a script. She said, "You'll be observed for your safety. A doctor will evaluate you in the morning." I repeated, "For my safety." She nodded like she believed it. I sat on the bed after they left. Thin mattress, bolted frame. The kind of setup that makes people feel smaller without realizing why. I leaned back, looked up at the camera, and stayed still for a few seconds. Then I smiled. They thought they had removed my access. What they had actually done was remove noise. No phones tracking location. No external surveillance. No variables I didn't control. For the first time in weeks, I was operating inside a closed system. I swung my legs off the bed and pressed my heel lightly against the frame. The insert inside my shoe wasn't there anymore. Good. That meant it was still exactly where I needed it. Hours passed. No interruptions, no sedation. They were waiting for a formal evaluation before pushing anything into my bloodstream. That told me Caroline had filed this as a controlled admission, not an emergency override. She wanted paperwork. She wanted a diagnosis on record. She wanted something permanent. She wanted me locked away not just for days, but for years. A conservatorship, control over my finances, control over my decisions. Control over everything I had earned, everything I owned, everything I might ever become. And she was going to use my own family to do it. The people who were supposed to protect me. The people who were supposed to believe me. They were going to sign the papers that made me a ward of the state, that made me a legal non-person, that made everything I said automatically unreliable. Around what I guessed was early evening, the door opened. Caroline walked in first, no tears this time. Julian followed behind her, closing the door like he belonged there. The nurse gave me one last look, then stepped out and shut it behind them. I heard the lock engage. Caroline stood there for a second just looking at me. Then she smiled, not the soft, concerned version from dinner. This one was clean, sharp, honest. She said, "There you are." I didn't move. I said, you dropped the performance fast. She laughed under her breath. She said, I didn't think you'd notice. I said, I always notice when you stop pretending to be human. Julian shifted his weight. He was uncomfortable but trying not to show it. He kept his hands in his pockets like he didn't trust what to do with them. Caroline walked closer and tossed a folder onto the bed beside me. She said, go ahead, read your future. I didn't reach for it right away. I just looked at her. I said, confident. She replied, I earned it. I picked up the folder and flipped it open. Fabricated psychiatric evaluations, witness statements, behavioral notes. All aligned, all consistent, all written in the same tone that makes lies feel clinical. Paranoid ideation, delusional fixation, escalating instability, clean work. I said, you spent time on this. Caroline crossed her arms. She said, I had help. I glanced at Julian. He didn't deny it. Caroline stepped closer, lowering her voice like we were sharing something intimate. She said, Julian is about to sign a $500 million contract with the Department of Defense. Do you understand what that means? I said. It means someone didn't vet him properly. She ignored that. She continued. It means everything you've been digging into becomes irrelevant, because now you're not a credible source. You're a diagnosed paranoid with a documented history of delusions. Julian finally spoke. He said, your reports won't hold weight, not after this. I closed the folder and set it beside me. I asked, and the conservatorship? Caroline smiled again, slower this time. She said, there it is, you figured it out. Julian nodded like he was explaining a business plan. He said, medical guardianship. Temporary at first, then extended. Control over your finances, your military retirement accounts, your assets, everything you earned. Caroline added, managed by people who actually know how to use it. I looked at her. I said, you mean you? She didn't even pretend to deny it. She said, yes. Silence settled in the room for a second, not tense, just clear. Caroline tilted her head slightly. She said, you should be angry or scared or something. I said, I'm thinking. She asked, about what? I said, how predictable this is. Julian exhaled, irritated. He said, you're in a locked room, no phone, no access. No one outside this facility is going to take you seriously after tomorrow. Caroline leaned in a little closer. She said, you lost. I let that sit there. Then I looked up at the camera in the corner. Black dome, standard internal surveillance, fixed angle, no visible microphone. Caroline followed my gaze and rolled her eyes. She said, oh, please, they don't record audio in here. It's for observation. I said, of course it is. I looked back at her. I said, your plan is solid on paper. Julian frowned slightly. He asked, what does that mean? I said, it means you covered the obvious angles, diagnosis, credibility, financial control. Timing. Caroline's smile came back. She said, there's no other angle that matters. I nodded once. I said, that's where you're wrong. She didn't like that. She said, you're still doing it, that tone like you're 10 steps ahead. I said, I am. Julian scoffed. He said, you're sitting in a padded room. I said, exactly. Caroline crossed her arms tighter. She said, say it clearly, Evelyn, what are you trying to prove? I leaned back slightly, keeping my eyes on her. I said, you built this entire plan assuming containment equals silence. Julian snapped, it does. I said calmly, no, it just limits direction. Caroline's expression shifted just a fraction. Not fear, not yet, just irritation. She said, you're not making sense. I said, I am, you're just not listening. I tapped lightly against the side of my heel. I said, perfect setup, controlled environment, no external communication, no witnesses who matter. Julian stepped forward a little. He said, that's the point. I smiled just enough. I said, Caroline, you forgot one thing. She didn't respond right away. She asked, what? I said, the walls in psychiatric isolation rooms are designed to keep sound from getting out. I glanced around. I continued, they're not designed to block data transmission. Silence, actual silence this time. Julian looked at Caroline. Caroline looked at me. Then she laughed short, dismissive. She said, there it is, that's the delusion they warned us about. Julian shook his head. He said, you really think what? There's some signal getting out of here. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Caroline stepped back, recovering fast. She said, this is why you're here. You hear yourself, right? I leaned forward slightly. I said, do you? That was enough. She turned toward the door, already done with the conversation. She said over her shoulder, enjoy the evaluation tomorrow. By the time you're officially diagnosed, none of this will matter. Julian gave me one last look, not confident anymore, not calm, just uncertain. Then they left. The door shut. The lock clicked. I waited 5 seconds, 10. Then I reached down and pressed my thumb into the seam inside my heel. The thin layer of synthetic skin peeled back clean underneath it, exactly where I left it. A microtransceiver no bigger than a grain of rice. I held it between my fingers for a moment. Then I smiled. Caroline thought she had just sealed me in. What she actually did was give me the quietest command center I could have asked for, and she walked out of that room thinking I was the one losing control. I rolled the chip between my fingers until I heard footsteps outside my door. It went back into place under my heel in one smooth motion. By the time the lock clicked open, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands relaxed, posture neutral, calm, patient, no resistance, no urgency. The nurse didn't meet my eyes this time. She said, "Dr. Thorne will see you now." Of course he would. I stood up and followed her out into the hallway, same clean lines, same controlled quiet. Staff moving with purpose, but never fast enough to look stressed. Everything designed to feel safe, while decisions got made about you without you. We stopped at an office halfway down the corridor. She opened the door and stepped aside. I went in. Dr. Aries Thorne sat behind a wide desk with a tablet in front of him and a paper file open beside it. Mid-50s, clean haircut, controlled posture. The kind of man who had spent his entire career believing he was the smartest person in every room. He didn't stand when I walked in. That told me more than his credentials ever would. He said, "Evelyn," like we were meeting at a conference instead of a locked facility. "Please have a seat." I sat. He glanced down at the file, flipped a page, then looked at me with a measured expression. He said, "I've reviewed the intake notes provided by your family. There's a consistent pattern here. Reports of paranoia, fixation on surveillance, accusations that don't align with verified reality." I didn't respond. He kept going. He said, "Former military personnel sometimes experience difficulty adjusting after service. It's not uncommon to develop." I said, "Stop." He blinked once, not used to being interrupted. He said, "Excuse me." I leaned back slightly in the chair. I said, "Before you finish that sentence, before you write anything down, and definitely before you authorize any medication, I need you to open your computer." He frowned. He said, "That's not how this works." I said, "It is today." His expression tightened. He said, "Evelyn, this isn't a negotiation. I'm here to evaluate your condition." I said, "And I'm giving you a chance to not destroy your career in the next 5 minutes. That landed. Not enough to convince him, enough to irritate him. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. He said, "You're reinforcing the exact behavior described in your file: grandiosity, control issues, deflection." I nodded once. I said, "Open the computer." He said, "No." I watched him for a second, then I spoke slower. I said, "Your license, your facility, your personal liability, all of it is about to be tied to a federal violation if you don't listen to me right now." He almost smiled. Almost. He asked, "Do you hear how that sounds?" I replied, "Do you understand how real it is?" Silence. He looked at me, trying to decide whether this was worth indulging or shutting down. Curiosity won. It usually does. He turned slightly, tapped a key, and woke his computer screen. He said, "Fine, let's entertain this. What exactly am I supposed to do?" I said, "Log into your system." He did. I said, "Now open a browser." He hesitated for half a second, then followed through. I said, "Type this exactly." He waited. I added, "Don't use the social security number in that file. It's fake." His eyes flicked to the folder, then back to me. I said, "Type the address." I gave him a secure DoD portal URL. He paused again. He said, "You're asking me to access a federal system without authorization." I said, "You already did something worse. This just tells you how bad it is." That got him moving. He typed it in. The login screen appeared, clean, black, official. Now he was paying attention. He asked, "What credentials am I using?" I gave him a 12-character alphanumeric string. He didn't type it right away. He asked, "Where did you get this?" I looked at him. I said, "Doctor, you're about 3 seconds away from answering your own question." That was enough. He entered the code, hit enter. The screen didn't load like a normal system. It flashed once, then everything went red. A black window expanded over the entire display. No branding, no loading icon, just text, "Top secret, SCI clearance, Agent Evelyn Vance, active status, do not detain, report any interference immediately." A federal seal locked into place at the top of the screen. No animation, no delay, just authority. Dr. Thorne's hand froze on the keyboard. Then he slowly leaned forward. I watched his face change in real time. Confidence to confusion, confusion to recognition, recognition to fear. The pen slipped out of his fingers and hit the desk. He didn't pick it up. His mouth opened slightly like he was about to say something, then stopped. Sweat started forming at his hairline. He read the screen again, then again, like repetition might change what it said. It didn't. He started, "You," then stopped. I didn't help him. He swallowed hard. He tried again, "You're," I said, "keep reading." He did. Every line made it worse because now he understood the part that mattered. Not who I was, what he had already done. He had admitted me under false documentation, signed off on my containment, restricted my movement, prepared to medicate me, all while I was flagged as an active federal asset, illegally detained. The room got very quiet. He pushed his chair back slightly like distance might help him think. It didn't. He looked at me now, really looked, not as a patient, not as a problem, as a liability. He said quickly, "I didn't know, the file your family." I said, "I know exactly what they told you." His breathing got sharper. He said, "I need to report this. I need to contact." He reached for his phone. I stood up fast enough to stop him. My hand came down over his, pressing the phone flat against the desk. He froze. I said, "Not yet." He looked up at me like I had just made things worse. He repeated, "Not yet. Do you understand what this is?" I said, "Yes, do you?" He swallowed again. He said, "They're going to," I said. "If I don't report, you will, just not today." He stared at me, processing, failing, trying again. He said, "You're asking me to delay reporting a federal violation." I said, "I'm telling you to correct one." His hand twitched under mine. I didn't move. I said, "You have two options. You call this in right now, and this turns into a legal mess that drags your name through every layer of review. Or you listen carefully, follow instructions, and in 24 hours this entire situation resolves in a way where you look like the doctor who cooperated." He didn't answer because he was doing the math. Risk versus outcome. Immediate exposure versus controlled damage. He asked finally, "What do you want?" There it was. I removed my hand from his and stepped back. I said, "I want you to continue exactly as planned." His head snapped up. He asked, "What?" I said, "Same evaluations, same notes, same behavior. You treat me like every other patient in this room." He said, "That makes no sense." I said, "It will." He shook his head. He said, "I can't just pretend." I cut in. "You already did. You just didn't know who you were pretending with." That shut him up. He looked back at the screen one more time, then at me. He said slowly, "You're running something." I said, "Yes," he said, "and you need to stay here to do it." I said, "Yes." He exhaled through his nose, trying to steady himself. He said, "This is insane." I almost smiled. I said, "No, this is controlled." He sat there for a second longer. Then he reached forward and closed the laptop. Not slammed, not rushed, deliberate, decision made. He said, 24 hours. I said, "Exactly." He nodded once, still pale, still sweating. But now he understood his role. And more importantly, he understood what would happen if he stepped out of it. I turned toward the door, then paused. I said without looking back, "Next time someone hands you a perfect story about a broken person, ask who benefits from it." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I walked out of his office like I belonged there, because now I did. And behind me, Dr. Aries Thorne sat very still, realizing he wasn't in control of this facility anymore. He was just the first man who figured it out. I stepped out of Dr. Thorne's office and saw my father before he saw me. He was standing at the end of the hallway with his lawyer exactly where authority likes to stand, out in the open, visible, controlled, still in a tailored suit, posture straight, chin slightly raised like he was about to brief a room full of officers instead of corner his own daughter in a psychiatric facility. For a second, I just watched him, General Marcus Vance. The man who used to teach me that discipline wasn't about control, it was about restraint. Now he looked like a man who had traded both for funding. He turned when he heard my footsteps. No relief, no concern, just irritation that the problem was still walking. He said, "There you are." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "How are you feeling?" Just confirmation that the asset hadn't been removed yet. His lawyer gave me a quick scan, clinical, detached. Already calculating how unstable I would look in a courtroom. My father said, "Have a seat," nodding toward an empty consultation room. I walked in without arguing, not because he told me to, but because I wanted to see how far he was willing to go. We sat across from each other at a small table. The lawyer stayed standing just off to the side, like background support in a negotiation that wasn't supposed to fail. My father didn't waste time. He pulled a folder out of his briefcase and dropped it onto the table in front of me. He said, "Sign it." I didn't touch it. I asked, "What is it?" even though I already knew. He said, transfer of trust assets, medical guardianship authorization, temporary. Pending review. I repeated, temporary. His jaw tightened. He said, don't start. I opened the folder, clean documents, professionally drafted, already prepared for submission. My name typed in multiple places, his name positioned where control needed to be, and at the bottom a blank line waiting for my signature. I looked up at him. I said, you came all the way here for paperwork. He replied, I came here to fix this. I said calmly, no, you came here to contain it. His eyes hardened. He said, Julian is backing my campaign. There are donors watching. There are timelines. There are consequences if this gets out of control. I nodded slightly. I said, there it is. He leaned forward. He said, this is bigger than you. I said, that's the problem, you think everything is. His hand flattened on the table. He said, you are in a psychiatric facility because of your own behavior, accusations, instability. You've created a situation where no one can trust your judgment. I held his gaze. I said, you never asked for proof, not once. He said, because there isn't any. I said, there is, you just don't want to see it. He exhaled sharply, losing patience. He said, I don't have time for this. Sign the document. Let us manage this quietly. You'll get treatment. You'll stabilize, and this family can move forward. This family? I looked at him for a long second. Then I leaned back in my chair. I said, you really believe that? He said, I know it. I shook my head once. I said, no, you know exactly what you're doing. The room went still. The lawyer shifted slightly but didn't interrupt. I tapped the document lightly with one finger. I said, you're not protecting me, you're protecting him. My father didn't deny it. That was new. I added, you're protecting your campaign, your donors, your timeline, your reputation. He said, and you're threatening all of it. I said, no, I'm exposing it. That hit. He straightened in his chair, voice tightening. He said, you are not in a position to expose anything. Not from inside this place. I almost smiled. I said, that's where you're wrong. He ignored it. He said again, slower now, sign the document. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I looked down at the paper, then back at him. I said, you used to tell me something when I was a kid. He didn't respond. I continued, never negotiate from a position of weakness. Remember that? His eyes narrowed slightly. He said, this isn't a negotiation. I said, it is. You're just pretending it isn't. I reached for the pen he had placed on the table. Montblanc, heavy, expensive. The kind of pen people buy when they want signatures to feel important. I rolled it once between my fingers. The lawyer leaned in just a fraction. Ready. My father watched my hand, waiting. I lowered the pen to the paper, paused, then pressed hard. The nib dug into the page, releasing a thick blot of ink that spread across the signature line. Not a name, not even close, just pressure, just intent. Then I lifted the pen slightly and pressed my thumb directly into the ink. Held it there for a second. Let it set. When I pulled my hand away, a clean fingerprint sat right across the document. Dark, clear, impossible to ignore. My father's expression snapped. He said sharply, what are you doing? I set the pen down. I said, leaving a mark. He said, that's not a signature. I said, I know. He pushed the paper toward me again. He said, sign it properly. I didn't move. Instead, I looked at him the way I used to look at him when I was younger, when I still thought he meant what he said. I said, you're a general. His jaw tightened again. I continued, you should know the basic rule. He didn't answer. I said, never negotiate with someone holding the nuclear codes. Silence, real silence this time. The lawyer looked between us, suddenly unsure if this was still a simple paperwork situation. My father stood up so fast the chair scraped back hard against the floor. He said, this is over. I replied, it was over the moment you walked in here with that document. He slammed his hand on the table. He said, you will stay here until you're declared stable. And when that happens, everything you've tried to build against this family will be gone. I held his gaze. I said, try it. That was enough for him. He grabbed the folder, barely glancing at the ink stain and the fingerprint, and turned toward the door. He snapped at the lawyer, come on. They walked out without another word. The door shut behind them. I stayed seated for a few seconds. Then I exhaled slowly and leaned back. No anger, no disappointment, just clarity. There had been a version of me years ago that thought someone in that family might hesitate, might question, might choose differently if the line got crossed. That version was gone. No one was manipulated. No one was confused. They all knew exactly what they were doing. And now so did I. I stood up and walked back toward my room, calm, steady, already moving to the next step. Because the moment that document left this building, it stopped being a tool against me. It became a trigger. The fingerprint I left behind wasn't just ink. It was treated, layered with a compound that would stay invisible until it passed through a standard bank-grade scanner. The kind used for processing legal transfers. The kind my father's lawyer would absolutely use. And when it did, every account tied to that document, every linked financial channel, every hidden route Julian thought he buried would lock. Not locally, globally. My father thought he had just secured control. What he actually carried out of that room was a dead switch, and he was about to hand it directly to the system himself. I watched the second hand on the wall clock hit 12 and didn't move until it passed. Timing matters when you're about to ruin someone's day. Dr. Thorne stood near the door of my room, holding his laptop like it weighed more than it should. He hadn't slept well. You could see it in the way he blinked too often and kept pressing his lips together like he was trying to hold something in. He asked, "Are you sure about this?" I said, "No, I'm certain." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, locked it, checked it again, then walked over and set the laptop on the small desk bolted to the wall. He said, "I shouldn't even be in here with this." I replied, "You shouldn't have admitted me either." He didn't argue. That was progress. He opened the laptop and logged in, secure system, hospital network, layered with his own credentials, not military grade, but enough for what I needed once I bridged it. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He said, "If this gets traced back," I said, "It won't." He said, "That's not what I'm worried about." I looked at him. I said, "I know, you're worried about what happens if it doesn't work." He didn't deny it. I pulled the chair closer and sat down. I said, "Step back." He did. I placed my hands on the keyboard and started typing. No hesitation, no wasted movement. The commands came fast, clean, precise. The kind of typing that doesn't look impressive unless you know exactly what you're watching. Thorne stayed quiet. He had stopped asking questions. Smart. I accessed the network through a layered route, piggybacked through a secure channel I had already opened the night before. The chip had done its job. The path was there. All I needed now was a terminal. The hospital system became a doorway, and beyond that, everything else. Thorne said quietly, more to himself than to me, "You never left." I replied, "I never left." I pulled up the flag document ID tied to my father's transfer paper. There it was, processed, scanned, logged exactly as expected. I leaned back slightly, then typed the command that mattered. Execution string loaded, trigger linked, authorization confirmed. Once I hit this, I said, not looking at him, "There's no undo." He swallowed. He asked, "What exactly happens?" I said, "Reality." Then I pressed enter. The system responded instantly. No delay, no loading bar. Just a silent acknowledgement that something very large had just been set in motion. I closed the laptop halfway and leaned back. I said, "It's done." Thorne stared at the screen like it might explain itself. He said, "It doesn't look like anything happened." I said, "It did, you just don't see it from here." Across the city, inside a glass-walled conference room 20 floors above the ground, Julian Mercer was about to find out. He sat at the head of the table, suit perfect, posture confident, the kind of man who believed money protected him from consequences. Caroline sat to his right, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched yet. She liked the image more than the drink. 2 executives sat across from them, one legal, one financial, both ready, both expecting a clean transaction. $50 million initial transfer, foreign source. Structured to look legitimate, Julian adjusted his cuff links and glanced at his watch. He said quietly to Caroline, "She's still in there." Caroline smirked. She said, "Probably sedated by now." He said, "Good, I don't want any noise today." She replied, "You won't get any, she's done." The accountant at the far end of the table nodded. He said, "We're ready to authorize the transfer." Julian leaned back slightly. He said, "Do it." The accountant entered the credentials, confirmed the routing, and reached for the final authorization key. A simple motion, a small click. Then the screen turned red, not a warning, not a delay, a full stop. Error, transaction blocked, account status frozen, authority federal compliance system. The room went quiet. Julian leaned forward. He asked, "What is that?" The accountant frowned, typing quickly. He said, "That's not possible. The account was cleared this morning." Julian snapped, "Fix it." The accountant said, "I'm trying." Caroline set her glass down slowly. She asked, "Is this a delay?" The accountant said, "No, this is a block." Julian's jaw tightened. He said, "Call them." The accountant grabbed his phone and dialed the bank directly. Seconds passed. Then he handed the phone to Julian. He said, "They want to speak to you." Julian took it. He said, "This is Julian Mercer. I'm looking at a blocked transaction on account." The voice on the other end wasn't human, automated, cold. Account access restricted under federal directive. All assets associated with this entity are currently frozen under anti-terrorism and national security enforcement protocols. Julian froze. He said, "What? That's not possible. There's been a mistake." The voice replied, "No error detected. Further inquiries must be directed through federal channels." The line went dead. Julian stared at the phone, then at the screen, then at the people around him. He said under his breath, "No, no, 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 this doesn't happen." The accountant was already trying alternative access points. He said, "Everything's locked, not just this account, all linked accounts, domestic and international." Caroline's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She said, "That's not possible. We separated the structures." The accountant replied, "They're still tied at a compliance level." "This is a full system freeze." Julian stood up so fast his chair tipped backward. He demanded, "Who did this?" Nobody answered, because there was only one answer and they both knew it. Caroline's face went pale, not shocked, recognizing, she said quietly, "That paper, the document yesterday, the one Marcus had her touch." Julian turned to her. His expression shifted, understanding hitting all at once. He said, "That wasn't a mistake." Caroline shook her head slowly. She whispered, "No, that was a trigger." Her champagne glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. Neither of them reacted. Julian grabbed his phone again, dialing a different number this time. He muttered, "No, no, no. She's locked in a psych ward. She doesn't have access. She can't." He stopped mid-sentence because he realized something worse. She didn't need access. She needed proximity, and they gave it to her. Back in the hospital room, I watched the reflection of the red system acknowledgement fade off the laptop screen. Dr. Thorne was staring at me now like he finally understood the scale. He asked quietly, "What did you just do?" I closed the laptop completely. I said, "I corrected a misalignment." He said, "That's not a correction, that's a shutdown." I stood up. I said, "Same thing." He ran a hand over his face. He said, "They're going to trace this." I said, "They can try. And if they do, they won't find me, they'll find themselves." He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't want to know. I walked back toward the bed and sat down like nothing had happened. Because for me, nothing had. This wasn't escalation. This was step one. Across the city, Julian's control had just collapsed in under 10 seconds. Caroline's plan had already failed before she even understood how it worked. And somewhere between panic and denial, they both arrived at the same question. How does someone locked in a psychiatric facility reach into a federal system and shut down $50 million? They knew the answer. They just didn't want to say it out loud, because saying it made it real. And real meant they were no longer in control. Not of the money, not of the narrative, and definitely not of me. I heard the first shout before I saw anything. Not panic, not confusion, aggression, male voice, loud, close, not staff. I didn't move. I stayed seated on the bed, one ankle resting over the other, hands relaxed on my lap. The kind of posture that makes people uncomfortable when they expect fear. Dr. Thorne had just left 10 minutes earlier. He was keeping his distance now, following instructions, staying useful. The hallway noise got louder. Boots. Fast. Heavy. A nurse yelled something about security. Then something hit a wall hard. I tilted my head slightly toward the door, right on time. Another voice cut through the noise. Julian, sharp, controlled but breaking at the edges, he yelled, "Where is she?" No answer. A second later, a scream, short, cut off, then silence. I exhaled slowly. They skipped subtlety. Good, that meant they were scared. Footsteps rushed closer. 4 sets, maybe 5, weapons. You can hear the difference if you've been around them long enough, the way movement changes. The weight in each step. Caroline's voice came next. Tight, strained, no performance left. She said, "She's in isolation, end of the hall." No hesitation, no doubt. She knew exactly where I was, of course she did. The lock outside my door rattled. Someone tried the handle, didn't work. A second later, impact. The door shook again, stronger, reinforced but not built for repeated force from people who don't care about damage. Third hit, the frame cracked. Fourth, the door flew open. 4 men entered first. Private security, not military, wrong posture, too aggressive. Weapons held like tools instead of extensions, but armed enough to be dangerous in a place like this. Julian came in behind them. Caroline right after. Her face had changed. No tears, no softness, no mask, just anger, raw, focused. She snapped, stepping into the room. You think you're smart? I didn't answer. One of the guards moved closer, scanning the space like I might disappear. Another one closed the door behind them. Julian stood near the wall, breathing hard but trying to control it. He said, "This ends now." I looked at him. I said, "No, it already started." Caroline stepped forward fast, stopping just a few feet from me. She said, "You don't get to do this. You don't get to touch our accounts and walk away like nothing happened." I repeated, "Our accounts." She ignored that. She continued, "You locked everything. Do you understand what you just did?" I said, "Yes." She asked, "You think that makes you powerful?" I said, "No, it makes me accurate." That hit something. Her jaw clenched. She said, "You're not getting out of here." I glanced at the guards. I asked, "Then why bring witnesses?" Julian stepped in. He said, "Enough, we're done talking." He nodded to one of the men. The guard reached into a small medical kit clipped to his vest and pulled out a syringe, clear liquid. No label, no documentation, just a solution to a problem. Caroline's voice dropped lower. "Colder," she said, "you're going to calm down, one way or another." I watched the syringe, then looked back at her. I asked, "Overdose?" She didn't answer, didn't need to. One of the guards moved closer, raising the syringe. Julian said, "You should have stayed quiet." I leaned back slightly against the wall. I replied, "You should have stayed patient." The guard grabbed my arm, firm grip, untrained for restraint, too much force, too fast. He brought the needle up. Right before it touched my skin, the glass exploded. Not cracked, not shattered slowly, exploded. Every reinforced window along the corridor blew inward at the same time. The sound hit first. Then the pressure, then movement. Black figures flooded the space. Fast, precise, coordinated. Delta Force doesn't announce itself. It replaces the room. 1 second you think you're in control. The next, you're not even relevant. The first operator hit the ground inside the doorway before the glass finished falling. Second through the window. Third already covering angles. Weapons up. Targets acquired. Not me. Never me. Lasers painted the room in red lines. Julian froze. One guard tried to turn. Too slow. A rifle was already pointed at his chest. One of the operators said, "Don't move." Calm, flat, final. The guard holding the syringe dropped it. Another said, "Hands up." Too late to pretend this was anything but what it was. Caroline didn't move at all. She just stood there, eyes wide, trying to process how fast everything changed. Julian raised his hands slowly. He asked, "What is this?" No one answered him because he wasn't the one in charge of the room anymore. The operators formed a perimeter, not around him, around me, clean arc, tight spacing, full coverage, a shield. One of them stepped slightly forward just enough to block any line that wasn't controlled. He said, "Area secure." Another voice came through comms, calm, professional, efficient, no wasted words. "Targets contained." I shifted my leg off the bed and stood up. No rush, no reaction, just movement. The room adjusted around me, not the other way around. Julian stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. He started, "You." I looked at him. I said, "Yes." Caroline finally spoke. She asked, "What did you do?" I tilted my head slightly. I said, "You brought armed men into a federal operation. What did you think would happen?" Her breathing got faster. She said, this isn't real." I said, "It is." One of the operators stepped closer to Julian, adjusting his aim slightly. He said, "Hands higher." Julian complied. No more arguments, no more control, just compliance. Caroline's eyes moved from the soldiers to me, then back again, trying to find a version of this where she wasn't losing. There wasn't one. She said slowly, "You planned this." I didn't answer. She already knew. Her voice dropped. She said, "You used this place." I said, "Yes." She shook her head once. She said, "You let us put you in here." I said, "Yes." Her eyes widened further, understanding finally catching up. She said, "You wanted us to come." I met her gaze. I said, "Yes." That was the moment. The exact second it broke for her. Not the money, not the system, not even the soldiers. The realization that none of this was accidental, that every step she took had been anticipated, guided, allowed. Her mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Julian looked between us, trying to catch up, failing. He said, "You set us up." I didn't deny it. One of the operators moved in and secured the guards. Clean, fast, controlled, no resistance. There wasn't any left. I stepped forward once, not toward them, just enough to be clear. I said, "This isn't extraction, this is containment." Julian's face tightened. He asked, "For who?" I looked at him. I said, "For you." Silence, heavy, complete. Caroline didn't blink, didn't move, didn't breathe the way people do when they still think they can fix something. because now she understood the one thing she hadn't considered. I wasn't trapped in that room, I was operating from it. And she had just walked herself into the center of it, right where I needed her. I raised my hand slightly and every weapon in the room lowered half an inch. Not down, not safe, just enough to shift control. I said, "Stand them up." 2 operators moved immediately, pulling Julian and his men into position, hands still visible. No sudden movement. Caroline didn't resist, she was past that. Julian looked at me like he was waiting for the next hit. He asked, "What now?" I stepped closer, stopping just outside his reach. I said, "Now you fix your schedule." He frowned. He asked, "What?" I continued, "You have a gala tonight, defense contractors, senior officers, press, donors." Caroline blinked. She asked, "You're serious?" I said, "Yes." Julian shook his head. He said, "We're not going anywhere." I held his gaze. I said, "You are on time, dressed properly, acting normal." He said, "That's not happening." I didn't raise my voice. I said, "You brought armed men into a controlled federal environment. You attempted to assault a protected asset. You can walk into that room tonight or you can disappear from every system you think protects you." Silence, heavy, he understood. Caroline looked between us. She asked, "You want us to what, smile?" I said, "Yes." She almost laughed. She said, "You're insane." I said, "No, I'm consistent." Julian's shoulders dropped slightly. Defeat doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it just looks like a man realizing the math doesn't work anymore. He asked, "What's the condition?" I said, "You attend, you don't run, you don't warn anyone, you don't cancel, you follow your original plan." He asked, "And if we don't?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the operators behind him. That was enough. He nodded once. Slow, controlled. He said, "We'll be there." I said, "Good." I stepped back. I said, "Release them." The operators didn't question it. Hands came off. Weapons stayed ready. Julian adjusted his jacket like he could put control back on with it. Caroline didn't move for a second. Then she did, but something in her had shifted. Not fear, not yet. Awareness that this wasn't over, that this was just positioning. She said quietly, "Tonight." I said, "Yes." She nodded once, then turned and walked out. Julian followed. No one stopped them. No one needed to, because now they knew exactly where they had to be and exactly what would happen if they weren't. That night, the ballroom looked exactly how power likes to present itself. Clean lighting, polished floors, uniforms pressed sharp, conversations controlled and just loud enough to sound important. Over 500 people in the room, military leadership, contractors, political figures, people who signed things that changed outcomes. My father stood near the center of it. Perfect posture, perfect suit, perfect smile. General Marcus Vance, still campaigning, still convincing people he was the right kind of man to trust. My mother stood beside him, dressed for sympathy and status at the same time. Lydia Vance, controlled, composed, watching the room like she was managing perception in real time. They looked exactly like they were supposed to. A strong family, a stable image, a narrative that held together. Julian and Caroline stood across the room. They didn't match the setting anymore. Julian held a glass of whiskey, but his hand wasn't steady, not enough to spill, enough to notice if you knew where to look. Caroline smiled at someone in front of her. The smile didn't reach her eyes. It didn't even stay consistent. It flickered, adjusted. Reset, like she was trying to remember how to perform something she used to control easily. Julian muttered under his breath, "Relax." Caroline said quietly, "Don't say that." He said, "You're shaking." She said, "I'm not." He tightened his grip on the glass. He said, "I said I'm not." She stopped talking because there was nothing left to fix between them. Not tonight. Across the room, applause started. A speaker wrapped up a segment. More clapping, more smiles, more controlled energy. Everything still looked normal. That was the point. The stage lights dimmed slightly. A voice came over the system. Formal, clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats." Movement across the room, chairs adjusted. Conversations lowered. Attention shifted forward. My father guided my mother toward their table, still calm, still in control, still believing whatever he needed to believe to get through the night. Julian sat down. Caroline followed. Neither of them spoke because both of them were waiting. They didn't know for what, just that it was coming. The lights dropped, full blackout. The room went silent. No music, no movement, just darkness. Then a single spotlight cut across the stage. The announcer's voice returned, formal, clear. "Tonight's keynote will be delivered by a representative operating under direct authorization from the Department of Defense." A pause, long enough to build expectation, short enough to hold control. This individual does not require introduction. Another pause, then, please stand. Chairs shifted, uniforms straightened. Instinct took over, people stood, all of them, even the ones who didn't know why yet. The curtain moved, not fully, just enough. Then I stepped out. Black Class A uniform, medals aligned, ribbons across my chest, everything in place, everything earned. No hesitation, no performance, just presence, the room locked. You can feel it when a room understands rank without being told. Silence changes, breathing changes, posture changes. 500 people stopped being an audience. They became observers. My father didn't move at first. Then the glass slipped out of his hand. It hit the floor, shattered. He didn't look down, he couldn't. My mother's face went white, not pale, empty, like something inside her shut off all at once. Julian stood frozen, no control left to fake. Caroline didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't move. Because she understood exactly what she was looking at. Not a mistake, not a coincidence, not a recovery, a reveal. I stepped forward once. That was enough. Every officer in the room came to attention. Clean, sharp, immediate, no hesitation, no confusion. They knew exactly who they were standing for. No one spoke. No one questioned, because authority, when it's real, doesn't need explanation. It just needs to show up. And it did, right in front of them. Right in front of the family that signed me away less than 24 hours ago. Right in front of the people who thought they had already erased me. I let the silence sit long enough. Then I looked out across the room and then directly at them. My family still standing, still trying to understand how something they buried was now standing on a stage they couldn't control. Because this wasn't their narrative anymore. This wasn't their room anymore. And for the first time that night, they weren't the ones being watched. They were the ones being seen. I lifted one hand slightly and the room held its breath without being told to. No speech. No introduction, no explanation, just a signal. The screen behind me came to life. No logo, no transition, just data, clean, direct, impossible to misread. A financial routing map filled the display. Lines moved across the screen connecting accounts, countries, shell companies, each path highlighted in red, each endpoint labeled Julian Mercer. Multiple entries, multiple transfers, dates, times, amounts. 50 million was just one line in a much longer list. The room stayed silent because this wasn't accusation. This was structure. Then the screen shifted. Documents replaced the map. Signed authorizations, digital confirmations, layered approvals. Caroline's name appeared, not once, repeated. Every document clean, every signature verified, no room for interpretation. I didn't look at the screen, I looked at them. Julian's face had lost all color. Caroline's hands were locked together so tight her knuckles had gone white. My father hadn't moved. He was still standing where the glass had shattered at his feet, still trying to process whether this could be stopped. It couldn't. The screen changed again. Video, grainy but clear enough, a private meeting room, low lighting. My father sitting across from a man whose face wasn't shown, an envelope on the table. Cash, not symbolic, not small, enough to matter. My father didn't hesitate in the video. He didn't question. He didn't refuse. He took it. Then he nodded. Agreement without words. The video stopped. The screen went black. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The kind that spreads through a room without anyone needing to speak. I lowered my hand. That was the cue. Doors opened, not dramatically, not rushed, controlled. FBI agents entered first. Dark suits, visible badges, direct movement. Military police followed behind them. No noise, no hesitation, just execution. The room didn't react right away. People don't move when reality shifts that fast. They wait. They look for someone else to confirm it. No one did. The agents moved through the space with purpose. Straight lines, pre-identified targets. Julian was the first. 2 agents reached him at the same time. One of them said, "Julian Mercer, you are under arrest for violations of federal law, including unauthorized transfer of classified military data." Julian didn't move. Didn't argue. Didn't speak because he knew exactly what was on that screen. They turned him, forced his hands behind his back. Cold metal clicked into place. Cuffs, real, final. He reacted then, not with anger, with panic. He said quickly, "This is wrong. There's been a mistake. I didn't." They pushed him down, face against the table. No resistance left in him. Caroline stepped back, then forward, then stopped again like her body couldn't decide what to do. 2 more agents approached her. One of them said, "Caroline Vance, you are under arrest for financial crimes, including money laundering and conspiracy." She shook her head immediately. She said, No, that's not. They reached for her wrists. That's when she broke, not controlled, not subtle, real. She dropped to her knees hard. The sound echoed off the marble floor. She said, voice shaking, wait, please. This isn't. She turned, looked at me. Not as an equal, not as an opponent, as something she needed. She crawled forward, hands reaching, desperate. Her fingers grabbed the edge of my uniform. She said, voice breaking completely, Evelyn, please don't do this. I didn't move. She pulled herself closer, gripping tighter. She said, I didn't have a choice, you don't understand. Julian, he pushed this. I looked down at her, calm still. She kept going. She said, we're family, we're blood, you can't let this happen to me. Her voice cracked on the last word. Not controlled anymore. Not performed. Real fear, real collapse. Behind her, agents waited, not rushing, because they knew she wasn't going anywhere. Julian was still pinned to the table. My father hadn't moved. My mother stood, frozen, eyes wide, hands locked together like she was holding something that wasn't there anymore. The entire room watched. 500 people. No noise, no interruption, no sympathy, just observation. Caroline tightened her grip on my uniform. She whispered, say something, please. I took one step back. Her hand slipped. She almost fell forward, caught herself. Looked up at me like she didn't recognize what she was seeing. That's when I spoke. Not loud, didn't need to be. Every word landed. I said, you're right, Caroline. Her eyes locked onto mine. Hope, brief, desperate. She nodded quickly. She said, yes, you do. We can fix this, we can. I didn't change my tone. I continued. I have a compulsion. An obsession with putting people who betray this country into federal prison. Her expression broke, not slowly, all at once. I said, and you just became my cleanest case. Silence, absolute. Then the agents moved in. They pulled her hands behind her back. She didn't fight, didn't speak, didn't cry anymore, just empty, cuffs locked, cold metal, same as Julian. My father finally moved one step, then stopped. An agent approached him. He said, Marcus Vance, you are under investigation pending formal charges. Not arrested. Not yet, but close enough. My father looked at me. For the first time that night, there was no control left in his expression. No strategy, no calculation, just realization. He had misjudged the only person in the room he thought he understood, and it cost him everything. The agents began escorting them out. Julian first. Then Caroline. She didn't look back. My father followed under watch. My mother didn't move until someone told her to. The room slowly started breathing again. Quiet conversations, low voices, controlled reactions, but the damage was done. Not privately, not quietly, publicly, completely. I stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked off the stage. No applause, no announcement, no closure, because this wasn't an ending. It was a correction, and now everything else would follow. I signed the final report and didn't read it twice. You only double-check things you're unsure about. I wasn't. 1 month was enough to turn noise into facts and facts into consequences. Julian Mercer took a plea deal that didn't feel like one. 30 years, no early exit worth mentioning, federal facility, high security. The kind of place where time doesn't pass, it just stacks. Caroline followed him down the same path. Different charges, same outcome. 30 years, no control, no leverage. No audience, just walls. My father didn't go to prison. Not yet. They stripped his rank first. That part mattered more to him. General Marcus Vance became Marcus Vance overnight. No title, no authority, no uniform, pension gone, reputation gone. Every speech he ever gave about honor replayed on networks that used his name as a caution. He didn't attend any hearings, didn't speak publicly, didn't try to defend himself. He understood the difference between losing a battle and being removed from the map. My mother disappeared for a while. Not officially, just socially. No events, no appearances, no quiet charity work to soften perception. She went quiet because there was nothing left to manage. The house was sold within 3 weeks, fast, below value. No one wanted to own something that had just been used as evidence. The story ran for exactly 9 days, then it stopped. That's how it works. Big scandal, controlled outrage, then silence. Not because people forget, because the system moves on. I moved forward. Different thing. DARPA headquarters doesn't look like what people expect. No big signs, no dramatic entrances, just clean lines and security that doesn't explain itself. I walked out the front doors just after noon. Clear sky. No noise, no cameras. That's why I chose this place. If someone showed up here, it wasn't for attention. It was for something else. I saw her before she spoke. sitting on the concrete bench across from the entrance, clothes worn, not dirty, just reduced. Lydia Vance didn't know how to look small, so she looked unfinished instead. She stood up when she saw me, too fast. Like she thought I might turn around if she didn't move first. She said, "Evelyn." I stopped, didn't step closer, didn't step away, just stopped. She walked toward me, each step careful, measured, like she was approaching something fragile. That was new. She said, "I've been waiting." I said, "I know." Her eyes searched my face, looking for something familiar, something she could use. She didn't find it. She said, "They won't listen to me. Your father, Caroline, this is going too far." I didn't answer. She stepped closer. She said, "You have to fix this." I said, "No." Her expression tightened. She said, "Evelyn, please, this isn't justice. This is punishment." I said, "Yes." She shook her head quickly. She said, "No, you don't understand. Caroline didn't know what she was doing. Julian controlled everything." She stopped. She froze. I held her gaze. I said, "Don't rewrite it." She said, "I'm not." I said, "You are." Silence. She tried again. She said, "You can still help them. You can adjust your statement. You can clarify intent. People do it all the time." I almost smiled. I said, "People who don't understand consequences do that." Her voice broke slightly. She said, "We're your family." There it was, the word again, still trying to do the same job, still expecting a different result. I looked at her, really looked. Not the version she showed at events, not the one who managed rooms, the one standing in front of me now, tired, afraid, late. I said, "You signed the papers." She flinched. I continued, "You sat at that table. You watched them bring me in. You didn't ask a single question." Her eyes filled. I said, "You didn't think." I continued, "You agreed." That landed. She stepped back half an inch, then forward again, like she couldn't decide which direction made more sense. She said, "We were trying to protect you." I shook my head once. I said, "No, you were protecting yourselves." Her voice dropped. She said, "We didn't know." I said, "You didn't want to know." Silence again. Longer this time, no easy line left, no angle left to take. She looked at me like she was running out of time, because she was. She said, "They're going to lose everything." I said, "They already did." She said, "You're just going to let that happen." I said, "Yes." She stared at me, trying to find something to hold on to. She said, softer now, almost pleading, "Anything, Evelyn, you can't be this cold." I reached into my jacket, pulled out a folded document, clean copy, untouched. I held it for a second, then handed it to her. She took it automatically, didn't look at it right away, then she did. Her hands started shaking before she finished the first line. Petition for psychiatric conservatorship. Her signature, my father's, Caroline's, all three. Clear, permanent, legal. She looked up at me, eyes wide. She started, "That was," I said, "yesterday." She shook her head. She said, "That was different." I said, "No, that was honest." Her grip tightened on the paper. She said, "We were trying to help you." I let that sit there for a second. Then I answered, "Family isn't something you lock in a room when it becomes inconvenient." Her breathing got uneven. I continued, "Family isn't something you erase when it threatens your image." She didn't speak. I said, "Family isn't something you ask back when you're out of options." The words landed exactly where they needed to. No volume, no anger, just final. She lowered her gaze to the paper again, like it might say something else if she looked long enough. It didn't. I stepped back one step. That was enough. She didn't follow, didn't ask again, didn't try to stop me, because now she understood, not emotionally, structurally. There was no path back, no version of this where we returned to anything. The line wasn't broken. It was set. Permanent. I turned and walked toward the vehicle waiting at the curb. Black SUV, reinforced, engine already running. The driver didn't look at me, didn't need to. The door opened. I stepped in, sat down. The door closed, solid, final. Through the tinted glass, I could still see her standing there, holding the paper, not moving, not calling out, just standing in the space where something used to exist. Then the vehicle pulled away, and she got smaller and smaller until she wasn't part of my world anymore. Not removed, not erased, just outside the line I wasn't going to cross again. I sat in the back of the SUV and watched my reflection in the window for a second longer than I needed to. No uniform this time, no medals, just me. People think the hardest part was taking them down. It wasn't. The hard part was realizing none of it surprised me. Not really. Most people think betrayal is loud. It's not. It's quiet. It's small decisions repeated over time until they stop feeling like decisions. Caroline didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy me. She practiced it. Little things first, twisting stories, testing boundaries, seeing what she could get away with. And every time no one stopped her, she went further. Julian didn't become dangerous overnight either. He just kept choosing money over limits until there were no limits left. And my father, he didn't fall. He adjusted. That's what people don't understand. Betrayal isn't a moment. It's a pattern. And if you ignore the small versions, you're going to lose to the big one. So here's the truth. If someone crosses a small line easily, they're already showing you who they are. Believe that version early, not the one they explain later. I used to think being smart protected you. It doesn't. It just makes you better at explaining away what you don't want to see. I wasn't blind. I saw the inconsistencies, the money, the behavior, the way Caroline controlled conversations, the way Julian avoided specifics. I saw all of it. I just gave it the benefit of the doubt, because it was family, because it was easier to assume I was missing something than to accept what was actually there. That's how manipulation works. It doesn't feel like control. It feels like concern. It feels like someone telling you you're overreacting, like you're tired, like you're not seeing things clearly. And if you're not careful, you start agreeing, not because they're right, because it's easier than pushing back. So here's the rule. Don't trust how someone explains themselves. Watch what they do when it matters. Behavior doesn't need translation. A lot of people are going to hear this story and think I'm cold, that I walked away too easily, that I should have tried harder to fix things. That's fine. They're allowed to think that, but they're wrong. Boundaries aren't cruelty, they're structure. And if you don't build them yourself, someone else will build them for you, usually in a way that benefits them, not you. I didn't walk away because I stopped caring. I walked away because I understood exactly what I was dealing with. There's a difference. You don't owe loyalty to people who use it as a weapon. You don't owe access to people who try to control you. And you don't owe forgiveness to people who aren't sorry. That last one matters a lot because most people don't apologize. They negotiate. They look for a version of the situation where they don't lose everything. That's not accountability. That's strategy. And I'm not interested in being part of someone else's damage control. People also misunderstand power. They think it's loud, aggressive, visible. It's not. Real power is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't need to convince anyone. It just executes. I didn't stand in that dining room and scream. I didn't try to prove anything in the moment. Because that's not how you win. You don't win arguments. You control outcomes. You gather information. You wait. You choose your timing. And when you act, you make sure it's final. If you're constantly reacting, you're already behind. Control the pace or someone else will. There's also a difference people like to ignore. Revenge and justice are not the same thing. Revenge is emotional. It's fast. It feels good for a second and then it's gone. Justice is structured. It takes time. It requires proof. It holds. I didn't destroy them, I exposed them. There's a difference. I didn't invent anything. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't need to. Everything they did was already there. All I did was make sure the right people saw it at the right time. If someone wrongs you, your first instinct will be to hit back. Don't. Pause. Document. Think. Because the moment you act without structure, you weaken your position. And the people who hurt you will use that every time. Walking away costs more than people admit. There's no clean version of it, no moment where everything feels resolved. You lose things, history, familiarity, versions of yourself that only existed in those relationships. That doesn't come back, but neither does the damage if you stay, so you choose, comfort or clarity. Control or chaos. There isn't a middle ground that lasts. Peace is expensive, but staying in something broken costs more, always. If you're watching this and you recognize something, a person, a situation, a pattern that feels a little too familiar, pay attention. Not to what they say, not to what you hope is true, to what's actually happening. Set boundaries early, not when it's already out of control. Don't wait for proof that feels dramatic. Most of the time, the quiet evidence is enough. And don't confuse loyalty with obligation. They're not the same. Loyalty is earned. Obligation is imposed. Know the difference. I don't regret what I did. Not for a second, but I don't celebrate it either, because this wasn't a victory. It was a correction, something that should have happened a long time ago. I just stopped delaying it. People keep asking me if I miss them. I don't. I miss the idea of what they were supposed to be. That's different. And once you understand that difference, you stop trying to rebuild something that never actually existed. I looked out the window again as the city moved past. Same streets, same noise. Nothing changed except what I allow into my life. That's the only part you ever really control. And once you take that seriously, everything else gets a lot simpler. Not easier, just clearer. And clear is enough. Final note, this story is a work of fiction, but the valuable lessons we discuss are entirely real and continue to happen to many people every day. If this style isn't for you, that's perfectly okay. Please feel free to look for other content that better suits your needs. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed. And of course, subscribe for more stories like this. Until next time, remember this: the people who underestimate you are the ones who should fear you the most.